All right, guys, we're back, and today we're really taking a look at America in the Great War, or World War I, as it's more commonly called today. And we have taken a look prior to this in another video. If you haven't watched it, please take the time to do so, about America getting pulled into the war. What led us to joining this war when we were so isolationist? So I'm not going to rehash all of that, but there is a video specifically dealing with it. For now, we have to understand that Wilson had really campaigned a lot on keeping us out of the war, right? And now that we're in it, he really has to convince the public of its worthiness, convince the public that it's a just war. Now, there were a lot of people who were kind of following world events and already believed it to be just, but there were others that still needed convincing. And Wilson wanted everybody on board. He wanted to pull everybody along so that we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. So what we're going to see is that he uses three major arguments. One, he says that this is the war to end all wars, that if we fight this war well, if we win, and if we do it the right way, basically bring it to a conclusion in the right way, that we may never have to fight another war as long as the world exists, right? We're going to be a peaceful society because we're going to address not only the causes of this war, but the causes of all potential future wars as well. It sounds nice. It may have been a little bit naive, but that's what he uses to sell this war. The other thing he says is that it's going to make the world safe for democracy, at least the world we're familiar with, the European world. We're going to make this world safe for democracy. And Americans loved that idea. We love our freedoms. We love our democracy. And we want that to be something that others get to participate in and experience freedom as well. So the idea of spreading American-style democracy around the world, making that a reality, was something that really appealed to many, many Americans. And finally, there was the idea that this war is so big and so pervasive that it was going to grow and get out of hand. And if we didn't fight it there, we were going to have to eventually fight it here. And making democracy, or making the world safe for democracy and fighting it there rather than here, are ideas that we still hear about in things like the war for terror and things like that. So it was a fairly effective argument, right? These three that he uses. Now we know that most people are on board. You're never going to get everybody, but most people are. But we find ourselves again in this situation that is not uncommon for us. Here we are at war, but we're not prepared for war. Our troop numbers are too low. Our number of equipment and machinery, it's just not what it should be for a war of this scale. So in order to ramp up for that, President Wilson is going to sign what's called the Selective Services Act. And the Selective Services Act require, for the first time ever, all men ages 21 to 30 to register for the draft. So there's this massive nationwide registry, and we're going to start to see numbers being pulled, and that's how we're going to get our numbers up, right? Is by instituting a nationwide draft. Now, our allies desperately want us to come. They desperately need our help because Russia is no longer in the war. They've had to kind of pull out in order to fight the Russian Revolution, right? The Bolshevik Revolution. And so they're no longer in this thing. And that means that France and Great Britain are desperate for extra help. And so that's kind of what we're walking into is it's not a certain victory. They need our help and they need it very quickly. To that point, America is going to mobilize, and we're going to see that 4.5 million men volunteer or are drafted into service for World War I. That makes our allies very happy. However, our American General John Pershing really frustrates our allies because he will not allow our men to see any battle. They won't go to the front. He implements this plan that is really seen as very, very cautious. I think it was pretty wise, and we're going to see why here in just a second. He says that American troops will only serve under American command. We want to have control over our own troops and how they are utilized. Okay. You can debate that one, but not a terrible strategy, right? The big part here is that no U.S. troop is going to see battle. No soldier is going to be thrust to the front battle lines until there are 1 million trained, equipped U.S. service members in Europe ready to fight. Now, our European allies wanted us to jump in as soon as we were there, a few thousand at a time as we arrived. And Pershing said, no, we want to overwhelm the enemy. So if y'all are holding your own, right, then we will overwhelm the enemy with 1 million fresh soldiers, 1 million fresh fighting men that are going to enter the trenches and overrun the enemy. And that was ultimately the idea, and it was largely successful. Even though they wanted us to get there and immediately come help out, this was, I think, a fairly effective strategy. We were going to protect our soldiers by using large-scale numbers to overwhelm the enemy. Now, this is a really good example of what we call a total war. We've seen a little bit of it before in the Civil War, but a total war is when the entire country's total output, everything is focused on winning the war. That's our military, our political world, the business world, the economy. Like everything on the home front, everything on the battlefront is all focused on this war. Very little was going on outside of how do we focus on winning this war and bringing our boys home. So the government is going to very quickly insert itself into many, many facets of American life and American business and so forth. And so that's what we're going to take a look at now. New agencies are going to be created. One is called the War Industries Board. And the War Industries Board is going to do things that government has never done before. In fact, I don't think it would have been allowed. There would have been such major pushback. They're going to set quotas for private industries. They're going to set prices for private industries. They're going to determine raw material distribution, which industries and which companies get raw materials and which ones don't, because things were in such short supply. Now, that type of thing is tolerated because, well, we're in war, and this is a major crisis. Tolerated in a crisis, but never would have been under peaceful terms. Other government agencies are going to set regulations on things like transportation and fuel and coal, and they're going to help set wages and avoid strikes. They're going to negotiate with labor unions and so forth. So there are a lot of ways that the government is really beginning to control and regulate and assert itself into the lives of everyday Americans. So one of these other things that we're going to see, and this is really kind of a dark thing, you'll recognize a problem with this immediately, is the Espionage and Sedition Acts. One was passed in 1917, the other in 1918. And these acts are going to prohibit all written and spoken speech, right? All speech that is critical of the United States, of our democracy, of the war, or of any action taken to win the war. If you speak out against it, it's going to be seen as treason. It's going to be seen as sedition, and you're going to be jailed for it. And so this is a major infringement upon our civil liberties and our freedom of speech, and yet we allowed it to happen because we were at war. People are often willing to do things that they allow things that they never would have allowed in a time of war in the name of patriotism. So you want to win, you want to support your boys, so you allow these things to happen. There are some fundamental problems with this, and we look back now and kind of cringe at the idea that we were willing to subdue free speech, even if it was in national interest. So what we'll see is that 2,000 U.S. citizens are going to be imprisoned, some of them for up to 20 years, for speech that was critical of the government or critical of the war. To me, that's a very big deal. I have questions about this, right? Not the least of which is, who gets to determine what qualifies as a crisis? And for how long are we going to allow the government to infringe upon our freedoms of speech or other areas of business before we take that control back? And who benefits the most from it? Is it the government itself, the very group that gets to decide whether it's a crisis? Or how about the idea that, well, can it be a social crisis? Can it be an economic crisis? What qualifies as a crisis? Those are things that really have to be considered and things that should be very troubling to most Americans. I think our civil liberties are never more at danger than when we are in a crisis, because that's when we are willing to allow them to slide for a little bit of extra security. So anyway, this is a dangerous area to be in. Now, another thing that we're going to see happen is the creation of the Committee of Public Information, sometimes called the Creel Committee after George Creel, who was the one in charge of it. And this is the propaganda wing of the government. Now, the idea of propaganda leaves a bad taste in our mouth. It makes us think that it's misleading, that it's just made up or lies. And that's not always the case. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it can be very accurate information, but it's information that is kind of aimed at doing one of a number of different goals, right? So some of the things that the propaganda was aimed at was gaining public support, selling those ideas of the war to end all wars, and so forth. It was also aimed at selling war bonds. We have to pay for this war. And we rose to the challenge. We bought all kinds of war bonds. The public really helped to fund a large part of this war. So buying war bonds, it encouraged enlistment. You saw on the other slide there, let's see, where is it? There it is, Uncle Sam, right? This is the first time he makes his appearance in that very iconic poster, I want you to enlist in the US Army. So encouraging enlistment. It also is going to demonize the enemy. It's a lot easier to kill someone. It's a lot easier to go to war with them when you don't view them as somebody's son or somebody's husband or somebody's father. If instead you see them as, oh, I don't know, a subhuman beast, a monster capable of anything, then it's a whole lot easier to go to war with them, right? And it also is going to be aimed at shaping behaviors. We'll see a little bit more about this. For instance, this one. This isn't about buying war bonds. It's not about enlisting in the army. It's about planting a garden. And the idea was that if everybody in the country plants a garden in their backyard or on the rooftop of their building, right? If they'll do those things, then our large commercial farms can food that would be sent directly to the war front for our soldiers to keep them healthy, to keep them strong, to keep them well nourished. Those type of soldiers can fight longer, they can fight harder. But if we're consuming all of the canned produce from the country, then they can't do that, right? And so the more we grow in our backyard, then the more we're able to send in terms of canned foods overseas. That seems like a really small thing to do for an individual, but if you multiply that times the millions of people in this country, it has a major impact. So shaping behaviors. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so you can see, because a lot of these are about enlisting. Some of them are about buying war bonds. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these things. Sometimes, again, it was about doing your part in whatever small way you could. Sometimes it was about enlisting. Sometimes it was demonizing the enemy. There were very famous ones. They always show the Germans as kind of subhuman apes, or with blood dripping off their fingers or the tips of their bayonets, looking over the ruins of European cities. Much like, whoops, wrong direction. Much like this guy right here, right? Destroy this mad brute, enlist. We have this subhuman ape-type monster, very clearly German, and we can see that by the type of helmet. But we see in the background the ruins of European cities, and he's come across this body of water and now standing on American soil. Again, kind of demonstrating that idea that we're either going to fight it there or it will eventually come here. A lot going on in these, right? Now, one of the other really interesting things going on in America that's related to the war is this idea of the Great Migration. Men from the cities, from the countryside, are going over to the tune of 4.5 million. And they're leaving behind them jobs. They had to leave the factories. They had to leave the farms. They had to leave those places. And so this represents a huge opportunity for everybody that's left behind, particularly women and African Americans. And so when we talk about the everybody pulling their part and doing their thing, there is a huge opportunity here for African Americans. And what we'll see, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, is that African Americans that lived in the Deep South are going to experience this mass migration where they move to northern cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, New York City, right? They're moving to these major industrialized centers to take advantage of job opportunities for wartime industries. And so it's a huge redistribution of the American population, or at least the Black American population. So now we see these urban centers that maybe didn't always have a huge number of African Americans, the populations swell. They're going to take advantage of these industrial jobs that exist during the wartime. And so here we see, wrong direction again. Here we see a very famous painting of the Great Migration, heading to Chicago and New York and St. Louis. And that's going to plant the seeds of things like the Harlem Renaissance and the seeds then even later on of the civil rights movement. So I love the idea of this redistribution of population and what we know it will eventually lead to. So the things that we look at in history are not just isolated. They play a role in what also comes next. So what we will see now is kind of, again, that question of freedom versus security. What are we willing to put up with from the government in terms of the loss of civil rights and the growth of power? And what role should the government have in being able to assert those powers in a time of crisis? Those are important questions to ask, and they're really very deep. They're not all that easy. But can there be a crisis where government grows and our civil rights shrink in, say, a depression or a pandemic or a world war? And we've seen all of those things be the case. We typically will accept those, at least temporarily. But the danger is once we allow government to grow, it very rarely ever gives that power back. It does not shrink freely. So we have to be careful and really zealous in protecting our civil rights. Fascinating period of time. I absolutely love this, guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of this. Make sure that you subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'd love to have you as a viewer on future videos. Make sure you leave any comments. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I may have left out. Let me hear you discuss it in the comments below. And until next time, thanks for watching.